Rubber Revelations.
In the 1980s, the most famous faces on television were made of rubber.
It's the Tebbets and the Thatchers and the grey major that people remember.
And they appeared on a revolutionary show that made satire an essential part of the nation's viewing habits.
In a sense, there was a need for that show. There was a need for that at the time.
It broke TV taboos, caused outrage, and showed the royals as a real family, warts and all.
Yeah, but what bloody good do they do?
And it meant that for the first time in the history of British politics, the population could recognise most of the members of the cabinet. That show was Spitting Image.
To me, Spitting Image is still the most exciting thing I did.
And the first series, everybody said was just terrible.
Yeah, they said it was awful.
The second series, they said it was...
not as good as the first series.
and it just sort of went on like that, really. It just...
The third series, they said, where are the glory days of the early
show
episodes?
one that we all hated.
Would you like to order, sir?
Yes, I will have a steak.
How'd you like it?
Oh, raw, please.
And what about the vegetables?
Oh, they'll have the same as me.
That'll be absolutely thank you.
The show everyone loved to hate lasted from 1984 to 1996. But our story starts in the late 70s with graphic designer Martin Lambie-Nairn, who worked on LWT's heavyweight political programme Weekend World. For light relief, he had another show on in the background.
There was a programme on BBC Radio called Weekending, which was a satire show, and I thought it was the best thing. I just thought to myself, wouldn't it be brilliant if you could actually visualise this thing?
Anyone got any ideas? Aha!
One night, and I have to say it really was, in the middle of the night, I suddenly sat up in bed and said, it's puppets, and it's Roger Law and Peter Fluck. And that was it.
In the early 1980s, Peter Fluck and Roger Law were big stars on the political satire scene. They started out as cartoonists, but became famous when they moved on to making 3D models of their targets, which were then photographed and appeared on magazine covers around the world. Fluck and Law seemed to be the perfect puppet masters, but could they master a puppet television programme?
It's quite clear we knew absolutely nothing about television whatsoever, about budgets or studios or puppeteering, directing, script writing, script editing, the whole nightmare world, you know.
So to help Lambie-Nairn and Fluck and Law develop their idea into a viable TV show, they were joined by Tony Hendra, British-born editor of National Lampoon, America's biggest satirical magazine, which regularly published Fluck and Law's artwork, and John Blair, a documentary maker who knew how to pull a programme together. But what they really needed was someone who had done comedy on TV before, preferably in a sketch show format, like Not the 9 O'Clock News.
I have the good fortune to be the first Liberal leader for over half a century who's able to say to you at the end of our annual assembly, go back to your constituencies and prepare for government.
With the know-how and a team of sketch writers at his disposal, Not the 9 O'Clock News producer John Lloyd saw that there was only one solution to the Spitting Image problem: hiring John Lloyd.
I rushed around there and said, I literally am the only person who's got the work experience to be able to do this show, because and I want to do it. I have to do this. This is going to be the next big thing.
As far as the writing and the organisation of a television programme, a funny television programme is concerned, he was just, gold.
But could Golden Boy John Lloyd sell Spitting Image to a broadcaster as effectively as he'd sold John Lloyd to Spitting Image?
So they say, puppet show. Oh, a kid's show. I say, no, it's for grown-ups. Well, how can it be? It can't be. It's if it's got puppets in it. He said, well, it's going to have, politicians and stuff. And people say, well, why would that be funny? What would be funny about having politicians as puppets? So, and it's very hard to explain.
Because up until that point, I'd spent 2.5 years traipsing around with a little folder with this idea in it and going and visiting Jeremy Isaacs and people like that because I thought it should be a Channel 4 programme. It seemed obvious to me this was a Channel 4 programme.
Channel 4 wasn't the only broadcaster to say no thanks to the puppet show. LWT passed, and so did Thames. So Lloyd began a journey round the ITV regions, which led him all the way to Central TV in Birmingham, where the director of programmes was Charles Denton.
Central must have been the last people we went to. And Charles saw what little stuff we had, and he immediately said, "I have 22. This is marvellous."
I think I led a sheltered life. I didn't know that John had previously offered it to Thames or to LWT, and that they'd both turned it down, but I was not going to turn it down. I think that we needed a little bit of healthy political disrespect and perhaps a bit of anarchy in the weekend schedule.
He was taking a terrific risk because I could imagine the one person that he really, really had any trust in would be John Lloyd, who was a proper pro, because the rest of us were a bit of a motley bunch. So, and it was not a proven technology. Nobody had done this before. The nearest they'd come to doing anything like this was the Muppets, and this turned out to be 1,000 times more complicated than the Muppets.
It also turned out to be about 1,000 times more expensive.
From memory, I think I committed £60,000 to a pilot. £60,000 at the time was a lot of money. It was certainly more than you'd commit to a sitcom pilot or a game show pilot. It was getting towards drama money, really. It was always going to be a pricey show.
With Charles Denton's money, the Puppet Men made a pilot in 1983. Unfortunately, we can't show a clip of it here because somebody lost it. Geoffrey Perkins, who went on to become a producer of Spitting Image, remembers seeing it at the time.
I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It was an extraordinary show, and inevitably was going to be a huge hit.
With huge expectations and an even bigger budget, production went ahead on a full series, and ITV's publicity machine went into overdrive. At 10 p.m. on Sunday the 26th of February 1984, 8 million people tuned in to see the very first episode.
What was the first show like? Well, all I can say is that none of my friends would speak to me the first 2 or 3 shows. They said, well, it's just shit. You know, it's just complete crap. What do you think you're doing?
I didn't actually see Spitting Image last week, but it was disgusting.
The best thing about the first programme was it allowed the second one to happen and so on, because we had to learn on our feet.
Oh, this is terrible, terrible.
And I think the trouble was that the pilot they'd taken months over, and suddenly they found themselves on this weekly turnaround that they just really didn't have a system to make at all.
The actual making of the programme was incredibly complicated. They drew cartoons first, then they made sculpted heads, then they made moulds, and then they poured in latex and they baked it. You know, it was like this enormous kind of weird Terry Gilliam art block where they had racks of, it would say hands, left, hands, right, heads, generic, and there'd just be heads kind of lolling there, sitting on tables, or one fallen on the floor.
Yes, sir, Arafat.
Here.
Ronnie Corbett.
Here.
Lester Piggott.
Adding to the complications were the frequent backstage bust-ups between the people who made the show.
586. Oh, my God!
There were a lot of people involved. There were 2 or 3 producers, and there were Roger and Peter Fluckenlaw, who'd had a really successful career as sort of satirists in their own right, and then there were lots of new writers, and I think there were a lot of people vying for space.
Ian Hislop and Nick Newman were no strangers to the cut and thrust of popular satire, having earned their spurs at Private Eye magazine before joining Spitting Image as chief political writers.
And it was the puppeteers saying the scripts weren't any good. The
voiceover people saying the scripts weren't any good.
The critics
saying the scripts weren't any good. Yeah. Yes, I remember that bit. I didn't know what I now know, that the team were at each other's throats for half of the time.
We had an absurd situation with 5 producers. Fluckenlaw, Hendra, Blair and me, and the idea was that every single thing had to be decided unanimously.
It was quite obvious fairly soon that Tony and John Lloyd wouldn't work as a team of producers. It was either one or the other.
And Hendra took the rap. It could have been me, could have been anybody, I suppose.
So Tony Hendra went back to America, eventually finding fame as the cricket bat-wielding manager Ian Faith in the movie This Is Spinal Tap. Back at Spitting Image, the comedy writers Rob Grant and Doug Naylor stepped into Hendra's shoes, and John Lloyd finally discovered the best way to make the programme.
The only way to do it is to do it like you would do an animation, which is you record an entire radio show with absolutely the best voices, and then the puppets mime to that. Then you get the best puppeteers doing what they do, which is puppeteering, and the best voices doing best what they do, which is voices.
So, talented but then unknown artists like Chris Barry, Steve Nallen, Rory Bremner and Harry Enfield were hired to record the voices. And the puppeteers became so good at their job that we never actually realised they were there.
The puppeteering anyway is about coordination. You're looking at a television monitor at your feet. You're, in this case, miming, operating a hand, acting with this puppet. And it's very heavy. You can't really see, and to try and mask your head as much as possible, you've got the clothes over your face, you've got wires dangling off you for the eyes, and you've probably got another person wrapped around you operating a hand who, if you move, comes with you.
And I can remember we did some musical numbers, and I had something like the Geoffrey Howe puppet. And you think of them as puppets, like almost glove puppets, but those things were 2/3 life-size and were incredibly heavy. And I can remember halfway through this song waving this around and eventually thinking, my arm's going to fall. And I decided it was about time that Geoffrey Howe had a little nap and just lay on the top for the rest of the song.
Finally, all the talents were coordinated and Spitting Image began to take off. Although it started out as political satire, the show now had the confidence to broaden its targets, and famous faces from the worlds of showbiz and sport had their latex doubles.
What?
Spitting Image also breathed life into Britain's most famous dysfunctional family.
I can see Her Majesty the Queen going down Pall Mall towards Whitehall, moving past Northumberland Avenue and finishing her go on Bow Street.
Thank you, Tom, darling. That was lovely.
You're welcome, Mum.
Boring and boring.
It did come across as sort of rather bizarre gathering of people and was quite fun.
The idea was that they were basically a soap opera, certainly the way they were portrayed. So we ran them as a puppet soap opera. They were the royal family, 15 years earlier, because basically they sat on the sofa, didn't they?
Oh, for God's sake, aren't you just sick of seeing common people on TV all the time? And all over the bloody papers, too. Common people.
Who wants to be my deputy? So you think I need a deputy, do you?
But for the best soap opera storylines, there was still nothing to beat Downing Street.
It just seemed as if that Conservative government was full of just great big characters.
I know what to do.
Brilliant. Fabulous. A real gobsmacker, PM.
Amazing. In the middle of a third term, you can still come up with a crack like that.
I haven't told you what my idea is, you creep.
Douglas Hurd had a very stupid Dalek voice, which was Harry Enfield, wasn't it?
But it didn't work last time. Telecom was useless before, and it's still useless.
Well, we clearly didn't privatise it enough.
To me, it was very important to make the voice look like the puppet, so that, because they're so big and so cartoony, if you had the real voice, you wouldn't kind of believe it.
That's the most hopeless idea I've ever heard.
But also, I'm not a very good impressionist, so I had to... A lot of them I really couldn't do, when I was trying to do them like normally. So the more I could make them over the top and the more kind of aggressive, the more likely I was to get the part.
Do we have any other business?
I bloody well hope not. We've sewed it all off.
The supporting cast may have been smaller, but it was perfectly formed.
David Steele blamed Spitting Image for the collapse of the SDP Liberal Alliance and the loss of his image as a politician.
What happens if we lose the next election?
We'll merge, David.
Merge?
Yes, into one party.
Even though David Steele, I mean, his voice is about that range. I think it's sort of about like that. But we made it very, very small and squeaky to go with the puppet kind of thing. And then David Owen, who was Chris Berry, I think, would do this sort of rather deep thing.
And what will we call this one party, David? Well, we'll take one word from your party and one word from my party.
Which words?
From mine, social democratic, and from yours, party.
Oh.
We're hopeless! Hopeless! It's inconceivable that anyone can cope less. We're not going to win, we don't know how. If we ever stood a chance, we've blown it now.
Then there was the good old Labour Party. Remember that? Led by someone called Kinnock?
Who is Kinnock? Remind me again.
Yes, he went to Europe, didn't he?
I've got another great idea. I'm going to stand for the leadership of the Labour Party. Vote for me, and I might have a bit of a look at the poll tax.
You are the leader of the Labour Party, you ridiculous man.
Thanks for your support, Royston. I'll take that as a definite yes, then.
But the show was always a vehicle for its leading lady.
Gentlemen, pray be upstanding for your most gracious sovereign, the Queen.
Good evening, boys.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
Mrs. Thatcher is a brand name, really, in spitting image terms, not a person.
I'm ready to see you now, Mom. I shall fire you all and do your jobs myself.
Everything is perfectly normal. I am in control.
We kept upping the ante, really. Roger Law would come in with a new puppet with mad red eyes and steam coming out for ears.
I've never liked that side of the family.
Oh!
Sweet and reasonable! Sweet and reasonable!
I think one of the reasons why the programme was a success was because it was on during her time.
It wasn't long before publicity-seeking politicians realised the awesome potential of Spitting Image.
Good grief, he exclaimed. Me on the O-level syllabus? Yes. He repeated in a pleased, flattered, but not going to let it go to my head. No, sir, not me. I'm just a humble genius wordsmith sort of way.
People like Geoffrey Archer sent in his voice tapes so we could get his voice right. People like Edwina Currie, who was only a junior minister, but became this big character just through being on Spitting Image.
It's difficult to remember the power that it had. I mean, it was getting 15 million viewers. That was more people than it took to elect the Tory government, which I think was 13.5 million voters. And it gave you an extraordinary amount of clout. You know, I remember sitting next to one of the managing editors of The Sun, I think it was, and he was saying, oh, yeah, you shouldn't do this, and Sun readers don't like this. And I said, but you've got a piddling circulation compared to what we have. You know, I get 15 million people a week turning on to my show, and you're only getting what? What's your circulation, 2-3 million? Nothing.
Spitting Image was so influential that it became a kind of unofficial opposition. Unfortunately, we couldn't vote for puppets.
Reagan licking, acid stripping, curb, brought insider trading, overbending, never-ending. Tory.
I think the best show we were ever involved in was the election show of 1987, which was done as a live show immediately after the polls had closed.
We weren't allowed out beforehand, which is quite flattering, because the idea that Spitting Image would influence the election, I mean, that's what you want to be told.
Well, on the basis of what we've heard so far on our poll of polls, we forecast that the new Parliament will look like this.
We took a bit of a gamble, because in the run-up to the election, everybody was saying Kinnock's 10 points ahead in the polls. He's going to walk it. And we just sort of thought, we can't really ever believe this of the Welsh windbag.
The polls have now closed, shortly to be followed by the rest of the hospitals, the schools and the BBC. Ha 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 ha.
And the opinion polls were way out because the Tories got in with a massive majority.
But it was jolly lucky for us that she won, because otherwise we'd have looked very, very silly.
Yes, there would have been compensations, though.
Yes.
Kinnock in power. Can you imagine it?
Come on, boyo. Pick yourself up. You're not finished yet.
By now, Kinnock wasn't the only one considering his future.
Well, it was hell, you know. It was really horrible doing it. The business of how hard it was. You know, I used to, get to bed at maybe 1:30 in the morning sometimes, crash into bed in the Holiday Inn and have to get up at 5 to read all the papers. And sometimes I used to just sit in the bath and cry, you know, it's too difficult, it's too impossible.
Instead of soldiering on like Neil Kinnock, John Lloyd left and turned his attention to Blackadder, a show with only one rubber-faced member of the cast. Next to leave was Geoffrey Perkins, followed by Rob Grant and Doug Naylor. In 1988, they launched Red Dwarf onto BBC Two, which co-starred spitting image voice Chris Barry.
I don't know, what is the point? Everything always goes wrong for me. I'm probably the only person in the world to buy a topic bar without a single hazelnut in it.
Rory Bremner got the chance to extend his range of voices on The Rory Bremner Show in 1988. And, in 1989, Ian Hislop and Nick Newman decided enough was enough. The new team brought in to replace the old boys included producer Bill Dare, writers John O'Farrell, Pete Sinclair and Steve Punt, and two new voices, Steve Coogan and Alistair McGowan.
I took over from Chris Barry. So I can remember doing David Coleman in a few sketches, and it had to be, Chris Barry as David Coleman, which it would have been anyway, because it was very, very funny.
Characters as Mary, Joseph, and the one and only Jesus Christ, who turned the lights out? What the hell's going on in here? This place is like a bloody circus. What's he doing?
But I made him more and more slurred over the years, which is what happened to David, really, and a bit more...
Oh, well, he wasn't expecting that, and neither was I. And, well, this is one battle the human is never going to win.
The new Spitting Image team barely had time to take their seats when they were faced with a dramatic new twist in the Conservative Party's plot.
Just before Maggie faced a vote for her leadership, there was a sketch I wrote, and it just featured her walking through an empty House of Commons, feeling a little bit nostalgic and lonely, and sort of hearing the echoes of her former speeches.
Not for turning. We shall go on and on.
The researcher at Spitting Image at the time had a friend who worked for a couple of Tory MPs, and we found out that these guys were so moved by this sketch, these Tories, that they actually voted for Maggie in the leadership election when they'd been planning to abstain, and that was enough votes to tip it over to a second ballot. So for all this time, we've been trying to write sketches to get people to vote against Maggie, and the only definite success we had was to get people to vote for her.
Despite O'Farrell's heroic efforts, Maggie did not survive.
Following the sad news concerning the Prime Minister, instead of the published programme, as a mark of respect, there will now be a piece of music.
1, 2, 3, 4. Happy days are here again. The skies above are clear again. We'll sing a song of cheer again. Happy days are here again.
I remember I was driving to work on a Thursday when Thatcher resigned, and sort of part of me was going, yeah, and part of me was going, well, what do we do now? Because if Major gets in, we are stuffed, because he was such a boring bloke.
We sat around and talked endlessly about how we could portray Major.
As your new and excitingly different Prime Minister, I'd just like to say, I am my own man. I am my own man. I am my
Oh dear,
own man.
he keeps jamming.
I think, funnily enough, the starting point was, in a way, the answer, which was we all thought, oh, God, how do you write for this grey man? He has no character, no charisma, he's just grey.
Not eating your peas, dear?
Oh, no. I'm saving them till last.
Oh.
And it just struck a chord with everyone that he was eating peas with Norma, just peas. It was the most boring vegetable we could think of.
All right, dear.
In fact, the writers found John Major so dull that they invented something completely preposterous and incredible to spice up his life.
You seem a little...
Upset? No, why should I be? Everything's just fine.
Oh, good.
Especially now that Virginia's in the cabinet.
The Affair with Virginia Bottomley, that was another series that ran over several weeks.
There is an example of how sometimes life can out-satire satire.
It wasn't because we thought that he was having it off with any senior Conservative women.
I don't think even, a room full of the most hardened comedy writers would have dreamed that Major and Edwina would be the couple.
More peas, John? No, it's all right. I already had a curry earlier.
Well, Ginny's a very...
Ginny?
What I meant was Virginia, Mrs. Bottomley's very popular with the voters.
I'm sure she is.
I often wonder if John Major sat at home with Norma thinking, thank God they said Ginny, thank God they picked Ginny. And in fact, he might have been delighted because he might have that perfect cover. She'd be watching Ginny like a hawk. Meanwhile, him and Edwina are at it like knives in the office, you know.
1992, another election year, another Labour defeat. Bill Dare couldn't face the prospect of repeating the same old Tory jokes, so he decided to take Spitting Image in a different direction.
I think I probably slightly reduced the amount of politics. I really wanted the show to be a popular show and for it to be funny above all else.
Why can't the world be like hello? Why aren't people nice to one another?
When it started, it was much more about satire and about a take on the world. I think as the show progressed, and certainly when I joined it and towards its latter years, people didn't really want that so much, and the sketches that were talked about weren't the ones about Gaddafi and Reagan, who obviously had moved on by then, but the equivalent. The ones that people talked about were the silly knockabout, Punch and Judy, almost showbizy ones with good gags and a surreal element to them, really.
The spirit of Spitting Image was also being recycled across the TV schedules. In 1990, Ian Hislop was helping recreate the show's earlier, more satirical days on BBC Two's Have I Got News for You? A series which could have been presented by John Lloyd, who fronted the pilot, while Angus Deaton was appearing in KYTV, a satire on cheap television, co-starring former Puppet Supremo Geoffrey Perkins.
How are the pictures transmitted from the studio into thousands of homes?
Well, I think you put your finger on it there when you said alpha waves, because that's exactly how they're transmitted. You see, these alpha waves...
Sorry, I didn't say alpha waves.
Didn't you?
No.
Oh, maybe it was me then that said alpha waves. Oh, there you are, so it was. Anyway...
Harry Enfield stepped out of the voiceover booth and in front of the cameras for his television programme in 1990. Among his many characters was a memorable creation by Ian Hislop and Nick Newman.
What's your name again?
Ah, nice but dim T, sir. 73 to 77. Then retake 78 to 84. Great friends with peers, nothing between the ears.
We make you wanna!
During the 1980s, Spitting Image had been amongst the most successful and influential programmes on television, getting audiences in excess of 15 million. But by the 1990s, it was down to a quarter of that, and Spitting Image was under threat from programmes that probably wouldn't have existed without it.
Spitting Image was doomed from the moment Have I Got News for You started. Because TV executives look at the telly and they go, hang on, that's just a desk, right? That's a desk, there's 5 people behind it, they're showing some news headlines and they're getting big laughs. Why are we paying a vast team of puppeteers, set makers, writers, latex moulders and caricaturists to make us a comedy show? The one thing I always feel is ironic about Spitting Image is that it used to be made in a studio in a building right in the middle of Docklands, and eventually Spitting Image had to move out and they knocked the whole place down and they built this huge glittering monument to capitalism right on top of where Spitting Image had raged against the establishment, and it always somehow feels to me like it's sort of putting satire in its place.
Tomorrow belongs to me.
Well, we certainly did for Maggie, didn't we?
Yeah. I mean, how long did she last? Ooh. What, just the 11 years and 3 terms? We finished her off.
Well, somebody told